got to move on, which is not what's going to be happening on the rails today or tomorrow. It's ASLEF today on strike, looking at no train services at all across large parts of the country. Let's talk to Huw Merriman, who's the Minister of State for Rail. Good morning to you. I mean, this is horrific for people, isn't it? Is the government doing enough, or is it, as we've heard from one of our guests this morning, really tying the hands of the rail operating companies when it comes to negotiations?
No, not at all. We have been able to facilitate an offer which has been put to the union leaders. The problem we've got is that they won't put it forward to their members. Similar offers have been put forward to other members of unions and they've accepted them. So logic would dictate if the union leaders did the same, we could see an end to this action. And I'm really sorry for all passengers who have been disrupted today.
Where are we at with the negotiations, though? When was the last time that you met with the unions, and when are you next planning on meeting with them?
So myself and Mark Harper, the Secretary of State, have met with union leaders just to facilitate and say, look, what more do we need to do with you and to the employers who are also in the room with us, and then they go off and do their negotiations. That's culminated in a deal which we felt would be good enough to be tabled. Interestingly, Mick Lynch's union, the RMT, on the Network Rail side, they did put that deal to the members. 76% of them who voted to accept it, so that's the end of the industrial action on Network Rail. But he won't do the same when it comes to those who work on the trains, and that's a disappointment, particularly with a weekend coming up with Eurovision, the FA Cup final. It feels like events have been targeted deliberately to really impact people the most, and it's really regrettable on Eurovision, which we're hosting for our friends in Ukraine.
Well, of course, but I mean, to be fair, I know this keeps coming up, but of course they're impacting the big events, because that's how they make their point.
Well, then they have to take responsibility for doing that. And it's not good enough for them to say they didn't realise that the events were on, which is what we've been hearing this morning from Mick Whelan, because either he doesn't have a very good sporting and cultural diary, or once he was told, he could have changed the dates so they didn't impact. I mean, Eurovision is a great celebration. We should be really proud to host that. I know that our coach companies and others will step up in the absence of trains, but you know, the trains should be running. This is a really sort of important day for us, and I'm really disappointed. As I say, if I hadn't facilitated an offer that was ready to be put forward to the workers, then fair enough, I'd take responsibility, but I've done the opposite. It's there, it just needs to be put to the members, and then they can have their say.
All right, well, why is it then that Mick Whelan has said they're in a worse position now in terms of the negotiations than they were 6 months ago?
Well, look, your viewers can decide. At the moment, a train driver is paid an average of just shy of £60,000 for a 35-hour week. This offer would take them up to £65,000. Bear in mind they've had pay rises of near 40% since 2011. It doesn't sound to me as if it's an unreasonable thing to put to their members and see if they wish to accept it. So he will say that because he just doesn't want to justify why he's not putting forward the offer to the members. Obviously things are in a better place because an offer's there for him. It wasn't there before. He just won't put it.
I mean, many people just want to see an end to this dispute now, been going on for 11 months, almost a year now. Where are we at with the minimum service level bill and the progress that that's making? Because that closes in 3 days, doesn't it? And that would allow a minimum service level during strike days.
Yeah, look, it's really important. During COVID, we made sure that the railways worked because we said that essential workers had to get to work. That remains the case right now. So we're committed to this minimum service level legislation. You're right, our consultation on rail closes next week. The idea is to get a minimum service table of legislation put together during the course of this year, which means that if there are strikes, then trains will have to run a certain percentage of the time. So at least that will give passengers a chance to use their trains, which is going to be very difficult to do today.
Can I ask you on a different matter, but obviously it's getting a lot of attention, is this, the bonfire of the EU legislation which we were promised by Rishi Sunak, which now doesn't seem to be happening, according to Kemi Badenoch, who seems to have taken it upon herself to decide that none of this is going to go ahead now. What do you make of that?
Well, what I make of that is that 45% of the EU legislation will be taken down, 15% will be retained because they're sort of part of conventions, so Civil Aviation Authority, at least 40% that we'll have to pick through. We will end the EU supremacy principle by the end of the year. We have looked through the legislation for the first 100 days of the Prime Minister's reign, as he said. But what we're focused on is, rather than just spend the time looking at the 40% and sort of legislating off it, why not reform it? Why not make it better? Wasn't Brexit all about the opportunities? And by reforming the remaining 40% that will be there and making it even better, it's a better use of our time. We're talking about matters like rail reform, minimum service legislation. All of that needs our internal lawyers to deal with. It's a struggle for them to deal with a sort of sunset clause that just takes all EU laws down that are in our statute book, some of which we may want to keep. We'd rather focus on reform and delivering the reform that I've just been talking about.
But I mean, David Mellor, who was on the show earlier on, who said he was, you know, in the leadership contest and all the rest of it, was quite a big fan of Kemi Badenoch, says she's getting out of her box now. She's embarrassing the Prime Minister. She's going above her station.
Well, no, look, every single proposal, change, policy gets signed off by the Prime Minister. He's at the top and we all respect him. So, you know, this will be a matter that the Prime Minister will have discussed with Kemi Badenoch. The change was made. The point that she's making is that she owns the change, she's responsible, she's the Secretary of State. I think it was quite refreshing to hear at the dispatch box saying that she owned it. Sometimes people don't always take responsibility. So, but the point she made is absolutely clear. EU supremacy ends this year. A huge number of laws will be taken down that we no longer need. But the point is, those remaining, we want a bit more time just to pick through them, reform them, and actually make them better, rather than just having a sort of end-of-year cliff edge approach for everything.
OK, Huw Merriman, really good to see you this morning. Thanks very much indeed.